Right. Hey, good morning, everybody. Let me just sort this out. There we go. So you should be able to see my screen now. Excellent. Okay, so my name's James Harris. I'm the Policy and Networks Manager at the RTPI. I'll be chairing today's session on Transport for Green Recovery, which is part of the Planner Live Online, the RTPI's Alternative Planning Convention for 2020. Please do get involved on Twitter as we go along using the hashtag Planner Live Online. Okay, so at the beginning of the week, we published our research paper called Plan the World We Need, which looks at the impacts of COVID-19 on the built environment and how planning can support a sustainable, resilient, and inclusive recovery. And of course, one of the key themes was transport. During lockdown, we've seen transport levels plummet as sections of the economy shut down and more people work from home, leading to major reductions in congestion, better air quality, and fewer traffic accidents. COVID-19 has also seen towns and cities across the UK reallocating space for walking and cycling to accommodate social distancing, with some rapidly accelerating plans which were already in development and others starting almost from scratch. But as lockdown measures started to lift, we've also seen some major risks emerge. Public transport capacity and frequency is likely to remain low for some time, and the funding outlook is pretty bleak. Sale and use of private vehicles is also on the rise. And this could really undermine some of the efforts being made to promote active travel and tackle air pollution, and of course harming the poorest and most vulnerable in society. Meanwhile, we only have 30 years left to reach net zero carbon emissions, which requires urgent action in the transport sector, which is now the largest UK emitter by sector. So the government has signalled that it wants to build its way out of the coming recession with new homes and infrastructure investment. But with all of these changes going on, it's more important than ever that we place sustainable transport at the heart of planning and avoid any decisions that might lock in future car dependency. Electric vehicles can help, of course, but we also need to reshape the built environment in order to reduce overall travel demand, get people walking and cycling, and support the safe return to public and shared modes of transport. So to help us understand what's going on, we're joined by three really great speakers today who can help us kind of dig into the impacts of COVID-19 on the different transport areas of the transport world, and help us understand what the role of sustainable transport is going to be during the recovery. So our first speaker is Fiona Blackley, who's head of Neighbourhoods and Networks at Sustrans, the walking and cycling charity. Next we have Haigh, who's CEO of Greener Journeys, which is a coalition of the UK's major public transport operators, and she's also the executive director of the Transport Knowledge Hub, which provides resources for local decision makers. And lastly, we'll have Jonathan Bray, who is director of the Urban Transport Group, which is the UK's network of city region transport authorities. Now, if you just take a quick look at the handouts section on the control panel of GoToWebinar, you'll find links to relevant RTPI work that's related to this session as a downloadable PDF. And if you're watching this session as a recording, then the links will be available on our website, which is rtpi.org.uk/plannerlive. We have some time for Q&A once we've heard from all three speakers. So please, again, use the control panel to jot down some questions during the presentations. As the other speakers are going through, I'll be taking a look at these questions and selecting a few of the juiciest ones to pitch to them at the end. But that's enough from me for now. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Fiona, who's going to kick off from Sustrans. So Fiona, if you unmute yourself, and then we can kick off with your first presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just struggling to take myself off mute there. Thank you and good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank the RTPI for inviting me to speak this morning, and to everybody listening, thank you for giving up your time. So hopefully we have an interesting session for you this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about walking and cycling and the world that has changed dramatically in the last few weeks and few months. I've worked in transport planning for the last 15 years, just over, and I don't think anyone would ever have predicted the change in the modes that we use in our daily lives that's happened to us in the last few months. And while it has taken a global pandemic to get to us to that point, which is unfortunate, obviously, I think we try not to talk about grasping the opportunity, because it's clearly been a really awful experience for the majority of people in the world, but we can have the opportunity now to think about what a green recovery might look like. For many people during lockdown, their horizons of travel were constrained quite extremely. Some people not even leaving the house, some people just living extremely locally within their local communities. And I do think that is one of the benefits that we can look at that has happened in the last few months, is how much people have learned and realised about their local communities, what they have, the little parks around the corner that they may have discovered on their daily walks that perhaps they'd never even really noticed, having moved in a few years back. People have valued immensely local facilities, local community shops, pubs doing takeaways. Those kind of community facilities have been absolutely invaluable to people. And so from the very negative fact that we've all had to stay at home, there have been some small benefits to what people have experienced. Before COVID-19, say at the end of last year, before we were really thinking about it, we were thinking about other global crises, the global climate crisis, certainly as far as UK and a lot of developed nations are concerned, the obesity crisis. These were huge pandemics, effectively, that we were trying and seeking to address in the sustainable transportation world. And although that context has changed and the focus has changed for the last few months, we need to remember that those things have not gone away. We still have a climate crisis globally. We still have a national obesity crisis, and the transport networks that we build, that we create within our communities, have the potential to address positively some of those crises. From a walking and cycling perspective, obviously people have been taking daily exercise. For a lot of people, walking around those local communities, as I've mentioned, has been something they've not really had the opportunity to do. An awful lot of people in the last few months have dug old bikes out the back of the shed. Many have gone out and bought new cycles. And it's really reminded people of the joy that cycling can bring, and the freedom and the local mobility that those active travel modes can offer to local people. We have seen in our towns and cities already that the traffic is rising and is now back to 80–90% of some of the pre-COVID levels in our big cities and towns. So a lot of our potential for green recovery is already slipping through our fingertips. However, when we think about planning communities of the future, planning the spaces and places that people will live in for many decades to come, it's really important that we remember some of those experiences we've had in the last few months, and make sure that we are prioritising human modes of transport that cater for people's actual needs. We've had decades of car-focused planning, and we have been gradually turning the tide on that. And we have an opportunity now, all of us in the planning world, looking at the communities in which we're all going to live in the future, to think about what we want those communities and places to look like, what we want them to feel like, how we want to be able to move and travel around those places, whether they be little developments in our existing conurbations or in new communities and villages that are created across the country. We have the ability now to, and the knowledge and understanding of what humans actually want and need and crave, and that is small scale community living for basic human needs. It might be that we do to some extent go back to commuting longer distances for some days a week, but a lot of the feeling coming out is that people will work from home more, not necessarily exclusively as we have done, but and the fact that we can take those longer distance journeys by public transport, and the smaller, shorter journeys by walking and cycling. Anything under 5 miles could and should be easily cycled. Anything under 2 miles could and should be easily walked. Those are the really fundamental basic tenets of what we need to be thinking about when planning our spaces and places for the future. I'm not going to talk on too much longer. We've got a great set of panelists, so I'm going to leave it there for now. Please do ask questions, and I'll look forward to speaking to you again shortly. Brilliant.
Thanks so much, Fiona. That was an excellent little run through of what's happening in the walking and cycling world. And just a reminder again to everybody listening in, you can use the questions panel in your GoToWebinar control section to jot down any questions that you want to ask the panelists during the Q&A. So we'll move on now to Claire. Claire, the floor is yours. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. And so I've been asked to say a few words about the role of public transport and buses in particular in securing a green recovery. But I think I should start by reflecting where public transport is right now as we struggle to cope with COVID-19. With governments urging people to avoid public transport, we do currently risk eventually causing gridlock on our roads and a surge in emissions to levels higher even than before the pandemic. We also risk replacing one health crisis with another. Road transport is the leading contributor to air pollution, which causes 40,000 early deaths a year. Diesel cars and vans are responsible for more than 2/3 of NOx emissions from transport. So by discouraging use of public transport to ensure social distancing, we are removing one of the most effective ways of tackling air pollution. A modern diesel bus produces fewer emissions overall than a modern diesel car, despite being able to carry up to 20 times more passengers. And there is also growing evidence that long-term exposure to PM2.5 air pollution is a risk factor in terms of higher infection and death rates from COVID-19. So any spike in air pollution as a result of increasing car use would aggravate any future respiratory pandemic. Having said that, of course, it is absolutely imperative that we do everything we can to tackle the immediate COVID crisis. But we need simultaneously to protect the foundations of any strategy to build back better, including promoting the responsible use of public transport as essential to achieving net zero, the levelling up agenda, and of course building a more resilient and stronger economy. So the forthcoming national bus strategy will need, in the first instance, to reboot buses, clearly, but it must also lay the foundations for maximising the wider social, economic and environmental benefit of bus travel. The transport's responsible for 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. It's the biggest emitting sector, the only sector indeed where emissions are continuing to rise. And rising demand for car and van travel is the central reason, one of the central reasons why transport emissions remain so stubbornly high. A double-decker bus can take 75 cars off the road. And the bus sector has actually reduced emissions from its own fleet by around 1/3 over the last decade. That's more progress than any other form of road transport. So it's also been very clean in terms of its own operations. Public transport access is also vital to reducing deprivation and supporting the economy. A 10% improvement in bus service connectivity is associated with a 3.6% reduction in social deprivation. 77% of job seekers have no access, and 87% of young job seekers have got no access to a car, van or motorbike, and in most instances are completely reliant on their local bus networks. 1/3 of people in the UK have deliberately caught the bus to have some human contact. So today, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is launching a plan to get Britain moving again after the coronavirus lockdown. This is going to be followed by a stimulus package to be launched by the Chancellor next week. The key question is going to be whether government is really taking on board the Committee on Climate Change's advice that we should be using COVID-19 as a defining moment in the fight back, in the fight against climate change. There's a growing body of evidence that green stimulus measures are amongst the most beneficial for the economy, both in terms of supporting new jobs and in strong potential to reduce emissions. The Committee on Climate Change has actually recommended low carbon retrofits and buildings fit for the future as one of its top investment priorities for green recovery. I mean, this will certainly support new jobs. But if we're to avoid locking in greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to be vital that these green investments are fully integrated with sustainable and public transport. New developments in urban centres, well connected by public transport, can stimulate 50% more economic growth than equivalent developments located less well developed, less well connected on the fringe, whilst of course dramatically reducing congestion and pollution. But there are currently some big barriers to integrating public transport with new housing. For instance, the planning and delivery of local public transport and new housing too often operate in silos. And a fragmented and short-term funding regime prevents local areas from planning on a strategic long-term basis. So we need a joined-up approach to housing and transport to encourage the development of housing in locations that are or could be well served by public transport. We need to reform transport funding and governance so that cities can plan for housing, jobs and transport on an integrated and long-term basis. A wholesale reform of appraisal will be needed as existing conditions favour car-based policies and investments. And local authorities, planners and transport providers need to work more closely together to ensure that public transport provision is designed in at the outset. We need to build 300,000 homes, new homes every year to tackle the acute housing shortage in the UK. It's going to be crucial that we avoid repeating mistakes from the past, where too often new developments locked in car dependency and increased congestion and pollution. So the Committee on Climate Change has called for strong coordination across Whitehall. A green recovery is going to require major changes to how we do things, and nowhere is that more the case than in how we're going to tackle our housing crisis. So to conclude, if we are to build back better from COVID-19, we need a green recovery with public transport at its heart.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Claire. Excellent whiz through there. Very much enjoyed it. And now we will pass over to our third speaker, who is Jonathan Bray, the Director of the Urban Transport Group. Jonathan, over to you.
If we can't be bold now, then when? If we can't think big now, then when? So what I wanted to do with my time is to talk about some ideas around how we support the central challenge, I think, before us, which is how we fuse the post-COVID-19 economic recovery with the climate agenda. And in doing so, how do we create places that are greener, that are happier, that are healthier, that are more satisfying, that are more beautiful, that are more equal places to be. So my 4 thoughts, or perhaps provocations sometimes, are as follows. The first is stop spending money on things that will make things worse. In particular, why are those transport spending still so dominated by road building, which is worse for the climate, which is worse for sprawl, which is worse for creating more congestion, and doesn't work in its own terms. It takes a long time to implement. The impacts are low and local, and the job creation that comes from it is also very low. The recent report that was done for the TUC showed that the job creation from road building was off the scale, as in it was so minimal, it was off the scale compared with other interventions. Yet still, these zombie road schemes persist, and we can see more of that in the Prime Minister's announcements today. I think there's something in the economic and political folk memory that whenever you have a major crisis, people go back to FDR and the New Deal, building the Hoover Dam, and then with picks and shovels building roads, whereas we don't build roads that way anymore. But still, this kind of folk memory, this persists. So that was my first thought. The second thought is that one of the other things we hear a lot about at the moment is we need to sweep away red tape and planning and make things more simple. I would say that we actually need to embrace complexity, because if we are going to have a chance of meeting climate targets, then we need to be working across sectors. We need to be working across transport and energy. We need to be working across transport, energy in the built environment. And instead of just having transport people in the room for meetings, housing people in the room for meetings, we need to get people from these different disciplines in the same room working together. And you can do some amazing things if you do that. So if you look at what Islington Council are doing, whereby they are taking waste heat from the London Underground to heat local houses, or if you look at what's increasingly happening in places like Nottingham and Manchester, where trams are powered by sunbeams, or in the Netherlands, where you can look out of your train window and see the turbines which are providing the renewable power that powers the trains. So we need to embrace this complexity in other areas too, like the future of streets, where at the moment we have lots of attention on pop-up cycle lanes, which is all good, but there are a lot of calls on street space which take a lot of thinking about how you reconcile the need to support local traders, outdoor cafes, active travel, trams, buses, climate resilience, anti-terror measures, how you support cafes and outdoor eating, all these legitimate calls on road space. How do we manage that as part of the future of streets? And this is really in part a case for planning to move planning back to something of the more heroic status that it used to have, and indeed the heroic status that it does have still in some countries, because you're going to need a lot of planners to reconcile these different challenges and to make the connections across these different disciplines, and to move away from planning as being some kind of residual, bureaucratic, box-ticking exercise which is constantly under siege from soundbite politics. So I'm making the case for that heroic nature of planning to come back, particularly around these complexities and the challenges around achieving what we all want to achieve. The third thing to throw out there is when we talk about transport in our heads, we're actually talking about transport in cities. And in some ways, transport in cities is a relatively easy bit, but cities are not everywhere. If you look at the geography of the UK, how much attention are we paying to what we do about transport and decarbonisation of the suburbs, particularly the existing suburbs as well as the new build? Not enough. And if we look as well at transport patterns there, the car is king in terms of modal share in general, and the car is emperor. In many of the suburbs, public transport has a microscopic share, and we need to face up to that. And so alongside continuing to support public transport and expand its role and active travel, we also need to look at trying to get car occupancy rates, the role of car share, the role of electric bikes, and all the other combination measures that could be applied in suburban environments. So we're going to do a piece of work with that, and perhaps collaborate with RTPI and other colleagues around trying to get a bit more focus around the suburbs. If you read some of the coverage at the moment, you can see there's a lot of speculation indeed about whether one of the effects of the COVID-19 crisis will be after the triumph of the city that we've seen in recent years, will we see the triumph of the suburbs, in that people look into their own personal resilience and the quality of life that the suburbs can offer, the ability to work at home. Will we see a shift away from cities and to the suburbs? Personally, I think it's a bit too early to say. I think it'll be quite a complex pattern that does emerge, but we still need to look at what will support the suburbs, and also look at things like broadband planning alongside transport, more integral to transport, going back to that idea of trying to look at break out of the silos approach to some of these challenges. My final thought is, in order to crack these challenges, we also need to empower city regions to be able to respond at scale and at speed to the enormous challenges that they're going to face post-COVID-19. and also meeting those climate imperatives. And we're still in this country, a situation where city regions the size of small European countries having to enter competitions decided by civil servants in Whitehall about cycle lanes, or are unable to properly plan public transport because they don't have the powers over the bus networks. This is not a way to plan long term and the kind of timescales that you need to do to crack some of these difficult problems. So when we know devolution works, we can see it on the ground. We can see the leaps and bounds in London that were made as soon as it was liberated from Whitehall control, and we can see similar leaps and bounds made elsewhere where the powers have been enabled to some extent in areas like rail in other city regions too. So I'll close there to repeat my opening thought really, which is if we can't think big and if we can't be bold now, then when? And also if we don't actively try and shape the legacy of COVID-19, then it's going to shape us and not always in the ways that we would like.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Very, very rousing stuff. And I think, it's really heartening to hear all three speakers reflecting a lot of the themes that we raised in our paper that came out yesterday. If I could ask all of the speakers to rejoin us with their webcams and with their sound on. I've been jotting down some of the good questions that have been coming in from all of you, so we'll crack straight into that. An interesting question for Fiona from a Sustrans perspective. We're seeing a lot of temporary active travel measures being implemented. Is there any way to is there any evidence base that's being built about how these are working on the ground, which can help us to decide which of these temporary measures we might want to make permanent? Is anyone kind of monitoring that? I think you might be muted, possibly. The sound isn't working. Okay, well, no worries. We can try and fix that in the background. Can we just check the other Claire and Jonathan? Is your sound working okay? Jonathan, yes.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's fine. Yes,
yep.
Yeah. In that case, just a question for the two of you. We've had a few questions coming in about the kind of balance between central government infrastructure spending and local authority spending. I was just wondering, do we think that we're getting the balance right at the moment? How much of this current problem can be solved with kind of top-down government spending? And where specifically do we think we need more powers and funding handing down to local and strategic authorities to help them make changes that are a bit more tailored to what's happening on the ground?
Do you want to go first, Jonathan?
Okay. Yeah, well, I think if you look at all the funds we have at the moment, they make perfect sense in their own terms. Why would you not have a fund to support buses? Why would you not have a fund to support new technology? Why would you not have a fund to support active travel, and so on and so forth? Makes sense in their own terms, but not when you're trying to deal with that when you're in the receiving end of those, when these funding streams have different timescales, different objectives. You might win some, you might lose some. And when things you might want to do on the streets, as we were talking about before about the complexities of streets, you want to look at these things holistically. Why would you do a road just to do a bus lane or just to do a cycle lane? So, and why on earth, on something as local as this, would national government get involved at all? It's local public transport, national intercity rail networks, those kind of things make sense. And if they were good at it, great, but I'm not sure national government's record on delivering quality compares with the record of devolved authorities when they have the freedom to do that. So there's that, and I think the other thing is revenue. We have this culture where capital is good and kind of Nordic and a good virtuous thing to do, whereas revenue is kind of a bit dodgy, a bit kind of suspect and should be eliminated as much as you can. Well, I disagree with that, because you need the revenue to pay the planners to deliver these schemes. You need the revenue to support the public transport that runs on the capital schemes, and you also need the revenue measures to encourage people and support people to use the capital on things like active travel. So We do need a new deal, particularly in the environment we find ourselves. Whether we're going to get one is another question.
So yeah, sorry, you finished, Jonathan. Yeah, I would really concur with absolutely much of what you said. I think we have to go much further on devolution. I think one of the things that's really, I think, wasteful is the endless kind. Now, you've done research at Urban Transport Group on just the amount of time and resource that's wasted in bidding for all these endless competitions for different funds, for this. And it mitigates against strategic thinking. I mean, we're going to move to breaking down silos and actually much more strategic thinking of bringing energy, you know, housing, transport, all of these vital elements together. We need a much better devolved structure. I mean, a much better. I mean, one of the things I was calling for in my comments is, you know, longer term devolved budgets so that local areas can plan for housing, transport, jobs on a strategic long-term basis. So I mean, I think it's a huge area. I mean, there's a lot to say really, but I would fully support what Jonathan said as well. We've got to break out of silos, and I think that's another key element.
For sure, and I think it's just so much easier to break out of the silos at a level which is lower than central government level, where it is just genuinely a really hard task. Fiona, I think your sound might be working again. Is that correct? Yes, brilliant. Yes. So just the question to you about whether there's any evidence, any tracking of all of the pop-up temporary active travel measures that we're seeing to help local authorities understand how these might be made permanent.
I'd say yes, there is some monitoring underway. Obviously, the focus initially has been on getting the infrastructure on the ground, and also that touches on the funding that we've just been talking about. The initial funding that's been made available is a focus on capital and getting schemes implemented on the ground, and the local authorities and the transport authorities don't necessarily have the revenue funding available to do all the evaluation and monitoring that we would ideally want to do on those kind of schemes. There's definitely qualitative evaluation going on to understand which of these measures are popular, where they're difficult, where they cause problems. I think the longer they're in, the more potential there will be for quantitative evaluation. And I know that it will be, for example, with the traffic orders that are being used in some of the pop-up cycleways, a compulsory part of those traffic orders is to carry out consultation and evaluation of those. So that will be something that it's a bit backwards to how we would normally do it. We would normally do an awful lot of engagement and build up before putting infrastructure in, and it's been turned on its head slightly now. But it is ongoing, but it's probably not as much as we would, as professionals, like it to be.
I think that's one of the things I've seen most clearly is that you know, the local authorities that have been best placed to respond to the big demand in new space for active travel are ones that already had plans in place, that were already trying to do it. They'd already consulted on them, and you know, it's been really tough for them too. But they've been able to just simply accelerate things that they already had in the pipeline. I think those local authorities where those plans were underdeveloped, or again have just been, you know, based around car use for a long time, have really struggled to kind of scale up in that time. So not to just kind of constantly ban the planning drum, but if you've got these plans in place, they're not just, what we've really seen at the moment is they're not just nice to haves, they're key ways to make the built environment more resilient to things that, you know, 6 months ago nobody was talking about, a pandemic, but now is the top of everybody's minds. We've had a couple of questions come in kind of broadly around you know, how can we make a kind of sustainable transport revolution work for outer suburbs and more rural areas? And perhaps a question maybe for Claire and Fiona a bit more, seeing as your Jonathan is more city focused potentially. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of shared mobility and whether that can overcome some of the barriers that we see towards, you know, in areas where public transport as we currently see it just simply isn't going to be financially viable. Is there a role for shared mobility, perhaps planning in mobility hubs where people can shift between modes a bit more easily, and maybe some of the things that might unlock that?
Absolutely. I mean, do you want to go first, Fiona, or? Okay, absolutely. I think the mobility hubs idea is a great concept that I think Como UK have been doing a lot of work in this space, and I think there's, but no, I mean, and certainly the role of shared transport, demand responsive transport, all sorts of, you know, other solutions for harder to reach areas, there's definitely a key role. And I think we need to look as well at how we can integrate with, freight. There were some years back, there was such a thing as the post bus that operated in Scotland. I think that kind of concept of looking at how you can, in those harder to reach areas, agglomerate with other services, I think could be very useful. But there's definitely, the overall, hopefully technology will help us. I don't think we've quite reached a tipping point yet with some of the platforms such as mobility as a service, but obviously we watch the space with interest. Anything that is going to help people immediately reach for car keys, if they can go for their phone and see what other options there may be, all the different sustainable transport options, to have all of that in one place would be very helpful. So anything, I think, that kind of presents a more holistic picture as well. But yes, I think there aren't easy answers to the rural transport piece. I think that is something that needs a lot of careful thought.
Yeah, I would agree. I think everything, particularly multimodal transport, is traditionally stuck in the it's far too difficult box. We can't even plan for one mode competently. Why would we even start thinking about bringing modes together? The reality is that is how people travel and how people want to travel. It doesn't matter what mode you use for the longest part of your journey, but you always leave your front door on your 2 feet. Every journey has an element of multimodality to it, and mobility hubs may well be something that as planners we can look for, that can really help to enable that. I also have a slight hesitancy about some of the technology, and particularly in urban areas we talk about the idea of electric vehicles and connected vehicles don't necessarily actually solve any of the congestion problems, for example. So they're not a panacea that a lot of the funding and the innovation and the exciting tech would have us believe. However, in rural areas it may well be that actually personal journeys are best served by individual mobility options, and the greener and cleaner we can make those for individuals in rural areas, the absolute better. And I do think it's important to remember that rural, semi-rural, suburban, urban areas do have very different solutions. But it's also about remembering what individuals are like and what those individual journeys need to be, and often they are multimodal. And it's incumbent on all of us to stop putting stuff in the too difficult box, and actually crack on with solving it together.
I don't know if there's anything, Jonathan, you want to add. Otherwise, we can move. We've got millions of questions coming in, and only a couple of minutes left. So I'll probably have to wrap this up in a second. Just one coming in. That's we've obviously seen Boris Johnson's making announcements of flowing out of central government kind of as we speak about the recovery. Again, kind of money promised for what sound like fairly traditional road building schemes and things to me. I was wondering, if you could just reflect on some of the key opportunities that you think are still coming up to be able to influence government's thinking and spending behaviour around this. Just kind of behind the scenes at the RTPI, we're about to commission some new research looking at the role of place-based solutions to transport decarbonisation, because the FT does have a transport decarbonisation strategy underway that's in development. We really want to be able to show that, getting people out of their cars onto more sustainable modes of transport where that's possible and achievable is part of that solution. But I was just wondering if any of you want to say a little bit about kind of any lobbying you're doing, working behind the scenes, new evidence that you might have coming out that you think can help to shape government's thinking here.
So I think electrification of transport is a standout for me. If you're looking at something that fits with an industrial strategy that would make a real difference on decarbonisation. We know the grid has greened with a remarkable pace. We know that the technologies for vehicles are becoming more available and cheaper. We know the car is not going to disappear. So I would say project should be the electrification of issues around HGVs and planes and ships, all that kind of thing, but domestic transport in cities. I think city regions have a key role to play. Come back to my earlier point about making the connections between disciplines, because part of this is getting the juice where it needs to be to provide the power for electric vehicles. But I would put that forward. I think the public would get it. It would create good jobs, and it would be a route one to reducing carbon from transport.
Thank you. Claire or Fiona, do you want to?
Yes, I'm happy to jump in. So I think that there are kind of, looking at decarbonisation particularly, we've really got to ride on the wave of digitalisation. So I mean, this is strictly speaking beyond my what I would immediately be looking at within Greener Journey's traditional research, but clearly, you know, that 27 billion investment, you know, fund for roads would be. There's a lot of people now saying would be better spent on broadband, including the Committee on Climate Change, but even the AA. So I mean, there's a clear opportunity there to divert. Mass transit will always, however, play an important role. You know, clearly digitalisation has transformed large aspects of how we interact with the economy, but cities cannot function without mass transit. So we've got to get the appraisal, we've got to get appraisal right, because I think the conditions are all pointing the wrong way. But I mean, the big ticket item that I do lobby for quite regularly is that we just need to unfreeze the freeze-in fuel duty, a signal that would be, you know, not only would it, you know, raise important valuable revenue at a time of record low oil prices, but it would send a clear signal. You know, so we really do need to increase fuel duty, or at the very least unfreeze the freeze.
Thank you. And Fiona?
Yeah, I would say that, obviously the way things have gone for walking and cycling funding in the last few months has been quite dramatic. I think that making sure, I think it's a really valuable point that's already been made about local authorities who are resource stretched, getting them to go through really onerous rounds of bidding to access that funding and justify it. While I understand the basic principles behind that process, it wastes such a lot of time and energy, and actually in terms of cost benefit analysis, walking and cycling schemes are relatively cheap for the benefit that can be delivered in very small scale communities. And I think Claire just mentioned about rethinking about appraisal, and I think rethinking about the whole systems and the approach of the way we do planning, be it down to appraisal, cost benefit analysis. Traffic modelling is my absolute bugbear, and the fact that all of our traffic modelling is based on data that's 10, 15, 20 years old, when the reality is we should be planning for the future that we want, not the past that we had. So I think there's big strides to be made in that direction, and there's definitely an opportunity for that right now.
Excellent. Yes, well, it sounds like one of those sessions where we all violently agree with each other, and the task is to get government to violently agree with us over the next couple of weeks. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there, because we're just running out of time. But thanks so much to everybody who's been listening in and firing in the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get time to answer all of them. But we can, you know, again, we can keep the conversation going on Twitter. So I've popped up all of our Twitter handles there. Bombard us with the questions that you want answered. We'll try and get to as many of them as we can. But yeah, thanks so much to all of our speakers for taking part. This is a really fast-moving time. Everyone is pretty working flat out, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So yeah, we'll leave it there. But again, yes, follow us on Twitter online. 10 more of the webinars coming up during the week. And yes, we'll keep on working on this issue collaboratively over the coming months, I'm sure. So yeah, thank you very much.